Hey guys, Christoph the Polish Geek welcomes you to the review of the new Masters of the Universe movie. And the first thing I have to say is that I haven't seen He-Man Masters of the Universe 80s cartoons, so I can't say I have any special attachment to it or anything, because again, I haven't seen the cartoon in the 80s, so when it comes to faithfulness, the spirit of the cartoon and all, I'm probably not the right person to really talk about it too, so I can't really judge the movie in terms of how faithful it is to the original 80s cartoon, because I just haven't seen it, although I will give it credit that it does look pretty good. It's like one of those cartoons that merely by looking at an image you immediately get very nostalgic, because even if you haven't seen the cartoon yourself, it just does remind you of those types of cartoons in general you've been watching in your childhood. And I'm a 90s kid, I was born in 1994, so again, I haven't grew up on He-Man Masters of the Universe, but once again, the images and the clips do look very appealing actually, and once again, it does kind of make you feel nostalgic for your childhood, even if again, I haven't actually seen it. And then of course, in like 2020 I believe, 2021, not sure, but yeah, I remember early 2020s actually, that's when Netflix chosen to adapt the sequel actually. And of course, when I heard it was Powerhouse Animation, the studio responsible for Castlevania, I was kind of interested and looking forward to it and excited to finally experience it for real, but then all the controversy and all started, and I kinda gradually lost interest and wasn't interested in trying it out. But then I talked to my friend who told me then that it's actually good, that it all depends on their attachment to He-Man actually, and then he told me that He-Man, the main character, dies in the very first episode, but then he said, but considering you haven't grew up on the 80s, you might really enjoy it. I loved it, that's what he said. So of course, although I did perfectly understand where the fans were coming from and why they were so pissed at the Netflix cartoon, I ultimately decided that because I was in the camp that actually grew up on the 80s show, so I never had any objective personal attachment to He-Man, even though I perfectly understood the frustrations of the fans. I decided to give it a try, because you just gotta see for yourself, don't you? But I turned off like halfway through the third episode because I just couldn't stand it. It was boring, and the character of Teela was so cringy and unlikable that even as someone who again hasn't seen the original 80s cartoon, I still thought it was a very cringy, unwatchable show. So yeah, I quit like halfway through the third episode and never went back to it again. And then, of course, now we knew that they announced a live-action movie. And at first I wasn't interested in it. I thought that, oh wow, like are they going to be adapting another animated thing into live action? Because I do want you to be aware, I'm one of those guys that in general, I'm not like particularly fond of adapting animated to live action, because again, I actually think that oftentimes animation is often one of the most appealing aspects of the work, so that's why I'm generally not a huge fan of turning animation to live action. But then I remember that there were several live action things based on animated things I really enjoyed, like of course Asterix and Obelix movies. Like the first two at least are really amazing, and I'm a huge fan of Asterix comics and cartoons, so I ultimately decided that there were times, and also people really love One Piece live action shows, so even if I might not be a huge fan of adapting animated live action, I can't deny that plenty of times it actually happened where something live action was adapted. Where something animated, what am I saying? Something animated was adapted in live action, and it did work from time to time. Not usually, but it did work. So ultimately, then more trailers came out, and I did ultimately thought it looked quite entertaining, and especially the look of Skeletor was really incredible. So now, after I told you all my history with Masters of the Universe and all, I think it's now time to get what I think actually of the movie. And I have to say, I was quite entertained. In fact, I'm going to go as far as to say I had a real blast with Masters of the Universe. It's by no means perfect actually, and I do objectively think it's a very flawed movie, and the biggest problem is I don't think the movie knows what it wants to be. It does wants to be a parody or a serious fantasy story, and there is this conflict because there are lots of silly jokes in the movie. There are some really funny, genuine jokes that very much landed with me, but then there are some really silly, over-the-top ones, kind of in conflict with more serious things happening, and that's actually my biggest issue of the movie. But also, the first thing I would say, the best part, by the way, is actually Skeletor, as the trailers have shown. Like, Skeletor was awesome. I think his design was really incredible, and Jared Leto did a splendid job portraying Skeletor, and admittedly, I'm not a huge fan of Jared Leto, and I actually don't like most of his roles he's portrayed, but he simply knocks it out of the park as Skeletor. Yep, Skeletor was by far the best part of the movie. Really incredible performance from Jared Leto, and he just looks so incredible. And then, I also think the two main characters, He-Man, or actually as he's called for most of the movie, actually Adam, yeah, that's how he's called throughout most of the movie actually. So yeah, I think Adam, He-Man, and Teela were both really well done and likable characters, and their chemistry was really great. It's kind of cool how you can see that Adam kind of had a crush on Teela, while Teela more viewed him as a little brother, which is understandable considering that she was older than him, and we do see a flashback of them in childhood, and yeah, it did seem kind of like little brother, big sister relationship, but I thought their friendship and chemistry was really good. And another thing I also have to give it credit that it did an excellent job at actually making me like Teela, because I already said I really hated the character in the Netflix animated series. Again, I turned off the show halfway through the third episode, and Teela was such a cringy, unlikable character, but again, this movie surprisingly made me very much like Teela, and I thought she was a really great character, and she was pretty hot too. And again, Adam, He-Man, he was a really great protagonist. And another thing, and that's actually another problem I had with the movie though, is that the movie starts with Adam being transported into Oklahoma, our world, the state of Oklahoma, actually Oklahoma City, and he basically says he looks for his sword and all, but nobody in the real world takes him seriously, and they all treat him as this freak who just has weird imagination obsession. And there were some really funny scenes there. Actually, I say those scenes were really the funniest ones, and I think they all very much landed naturally, because once they got back to Fantasy World of Eternia, that's when I thought that the jokes, it was time to stop with the jokes and make the story more serious actually. But the jokes in the real world were quite funny, but it's also actually where my other issue of the movie comes. I think that the real world kind of didn't really have much effect on the story. Again, I'm not familiar with the 80s cartoons, so I don't know. I don't know if the real world even exists in the 80s cartoon, and if it does, I don't know what role it played there, actually, so can't speak on that. But in this movie, it did kind of feel like kinda being thrown there for just the sake of it, because it's like he's there in the beginning, and then there are those several scenes of him looking for the sword, and then Teela finds him and takes him back to Eternia, and then the rest of the movie doesn't really go back to the real world. That's some outside of small reference in the end that I won't spoil here. So yeah, I really wish that there was an extended sequence in the real world, and I do wish it had more effect on the story, because while I do think it was a pretty cool and funny sequence and I did enjoy it, I do think that ultimately it kind of felt completely out of place the minute Adam and Teela went back to Eternia, because then it doesn't really play any more roles in the story. And also, the best comparison of the movie I can think of is that it almost feels like a Marvel movie, but a Marvel movie during the glory days of Marvel, because it's certainly a much better Marvel movie than any actual modern Marvel movie, except Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, but that movie is really amazing, so that's a very high bar to clear. But yeah, besides Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 and maybe Spider-Man No Way Home, I say Masters of the Universe is a much better Marvel movie than any actual modern Marvel movie. Again, I kind of felt like I was back in the days, in the glory days of Marvel as I was watching this movie, even though, as I already said, it does feel like the movie kind of goes way too over the top with some silly comedy for moments that are actually more serious, and that's my other biggest issue with the movie. Actually, again, my two biggest issues is the underusage of the real world, and then this real world having pretty much no effect on the actual story or anything, and then also a little bit too much of silly over-the-top jokes where I honestly feel they don't land. And I've seen people who saying that this very much felt like a Marvel movie, which, as I addressed, I very much agree, instead of feeling more like fantasy, like The Lord of the Rings, but I actually think it's for the best. If you try to make this like epic fantasy in the style of The Lord of the Rings, there is a huge, and I mean huge chance of completely ruining the whole thing, because to really create such a fantasy epic, and I've been saying The Lord of the Rings are my most beloved movies in existence, but to really create such an epic fantasy epic, you really gotta commit yourself to it and truly have love and know what you're doing. So I think making it more like a Marvel movie, I think it's a much safer bet, and that's actually why I think the movie worked so well for me, actually. Ultimately, I have to say, I had a blast with Masters of the Universe. It's by no means perfect, and it's a very silly movie that shouldn't really be taken seriously, but sometimes those are the type of movies you need. But how faithful it is to the actual original Masters of the Universe 80s cartoon, again, as I said in the beginning, can't speak on that, haven't seen it. Doesn't look good though, so can't really speak on that. But I will say once again that this is very much a turn off your brain sort of the movie, but again, it's wicked fun, characters are really likable, and the main villain, as I said, is really excellent and the best part of the movie by far, and ultimately, I had a blast with Masters of the Universe. So, thank you all of you for checking out this video. Press the like button, please subscribe to this channel, and I will talk to you soon in another video. Talk to you later, bye!